Well, hey, welcome back to 316 of Bible Study of Bridgeway Church. I'm Joel Leeson. I serve as the senior pastor at Bridgeway, and we really are honored that you're with us. If you're new with us here at 316 or Bridgeway Church, the reason that we call this 316 is connected to 2 Timothy 3:16 that reminds us that all scripture is God-breathed. It's coming from the Lord Himself, and it's useful and profitable in our lives for a variety of things like correcting, rebuking, training in righteousness, that we gain that which God has called us to have in order that we might follow Him fully with our lives so that we're equipped for all that He's called us to do. And so we're thrilled that you're with us for this study. Now, hopefully you've had time to check out some of the prior lessons we've done. We've gone through the majority of the New Testament. In this particular study, we're in a long run through the Old Testament prophets. We've done the major prophets, and in this sequence of it, we're in the minor prophets, and we're coming to the close. We are nearing the end as we talk today about Zechariah, and so we only have Malachi following this study, and it's been a fantastic study, I think, so far. And so I want to just kind of bring us through some things to set us up. Remember that of the prophets, this is a look at the writing prophets. Now, when we started the whole series, we started with Samuel, who's the first of the prophets. But then, and Paul documents or calls him one of the prophets or the first prophet. He says that in the book of Acts. And we looked at Elijah and Elisha, but those three weren't writing in this context. Certainly, Samuel wrote, and we have 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. But Elijah and Elisha weren't writing prophets. The major prophets are defined that way because of the volume of what they wrote. They wrote more than the minor prophets in most contexts. Now you see Isaiah had 66 chapters, Jeremiah 52, Ezekiel 48, and we've gone through those. Daniel was 12 chapters, but if you'll remember, Daniel wasn't originally coupled with the prophets at all. He wasn't coupled with major prophets, and he wasn't even coupled initially in the minor prophets. And so, and then you have the minor prophets, the 12 ones that we've looked at. And you'll see that Hosea had 14 chapters, and today we're in Zechariah, and that's 14 chapters. Some of the others were short. Obadiah's 1 chapter, Haggai's 2 chapters. But Zechariah covers quite a bit, and one of the things that I've pushed on throughout the entirety of this whole sequence of study is that to study the prophets is also a study of the kings, and to study kings, you study the prophets. They do run hand in hand together. So we'll often read from the writing of one of the prophets, and then we'll also see things in 1 Kings or 2 Kings. And also we'll see follow-up of 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. And I think that might be a good segue into our talk on Zechariah, because you had prophets that were prophesying in northern portion of Israel and southern portion Judah. We've dealt with that extensively in the past. But then you also had pre-exile prophets. You had prophets that prophesied amidst exile. That would be your Ezekiel, that would be your Daniel. But then you have post-exile prophets, and that would be your Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And because that front portion is a study of the kings also, so like Isaiah tells us, Isaiah 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. We study about King Uzziah over in the book of Kings. When we get to these post-exile, they've gone into exile in Babylon. Now they're being released. The Jews are being released to return to Jerusalem. What do you do in the way of kings? Well, you're able to look at the kings in Persia, and you're going to see some of that, I think, in what we're looking at. Now, one thing that I would ask you just to consider, do your own study on this. In the return back to Jerusalem, the rewriting of the story of the Jews begins with great fervor. And that's where you're going to get First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, a re-chronicling of the history of the Jewish people. Now, it's not confirmed that Ezra is the author of this. A number of scholars will highlight Ezra as the most likely candidate of writing First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. But either way, you get into the Qumran area, Qumran Valley, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and you'll find that the Essenes that lived in there were great documenters, that there was a fervor in the return back into the Jerusalem area. There was a fervor in re-chronicling the story of the Jewish people, the law, all of these things. And so you can find a lot of the history in First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. And I just find if we can couple people together, then we can study well. So we know that Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are going to be amidst also Ezra. And I'll also show you a couple more things as we go along. So jumping into Zechariah, chapter 1, verse 1, in the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo. So this is just giving us context. Okay, so the name of Zechariah, a very common one. You'll look in Chronicles, and because there's a rechronicling of the history, you'll find the name Zechariah, a high number of times. So the fact that it identifies his dad and granddad, it identifies the lineage, is to say this particular Zechariah. But one thing that I would want to point out to you is, do you see the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius? Darius was the king in Persia. Now, we're going to be able to pull from Ezra and Haggai and see the collaboration, or that they were certainly contemporaries. So I showed some of this, a lot of this actually, in our study of Haggai, so this will be a little briefer. But in Ezra 5, now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, so we know that particular one that we're studying today, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God, the God of Israel. Now jump to Haggai. Haggai chapter 1, verse 1, in the 2nd year of King Darius, same one, and you can read about or listen to the history that we talked about in the study of Haggai, because I went into depth on stuff. But in the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, so just remember, 6th month, on the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. So there was a sequence of time in which God was revealing himself to Haggai, prophesying to the people of God that had returned to Jerusalem. And Haggai's focus was rebuilding the temple, spurring them on to not be idle in the rebuilding of the temple, which the people had become because of danger and fear. Once again, we discussed all that in the study of Haggai. But when we come back, we see in the 8th month of the 2nd year. So we know that Zechariah is prophesying in the same time period of Haggai. Now, a couple of things on time. Haggai was written around 520 BC, and that is pretty well documented according to Darius. So once again, when people are returning to Jerusalem, I've often said this, if something happened to America, the United States, where all our libraries were contaminated, burned, and this is a little less of poignant with all the internet, but back in the day when it was all paper books, if something had happened to all the libraries and we were to return, the fervor in which there would be a rechronicling of the history of America, it would be exponential. So the fact that those that write the post-exile prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, they do a better job of dating things. They do a better job of chronicling when. And so we know that Haggai was written in 520 BC. We know the Second Temple's finished in 516 BC. Now, something to keep in mind, because we can't look at kings, because once again, there's no kings in Jerusalem. But we can watch what happens in Persia. There's King Darius, right? We saw Cyrus was the one that released the Jews to be able to return to Jerusalem. And then we find Darius. We're also going to fast forward a little bit, and you see in 478 that Esther becomes the queen to Artaxerxes. We're going to see in 445 BC that Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem. And so it just helps us understand kind of time range and what's going on and who's contemporary to who. Now, let's jump back to Zechariah because we have a lot to cover. So in chapter 1, verse 2, we read, "The Lord was very angry with your forefathers." This is Zechariah prophesying to those in Jerusalem. "Therefore tell the people, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Return to me, declares the Lord Almighty, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty." So let me ask you real quick before we go further, why was he angry? Why does it say, verse 2, the Lord was very angry with your forefathers? Because primarily rejection. Rejection of his covenant and rejection of the prophets bringing warning. Rejection of his covenant came by way of the kings and their idolatry that allowed for injustice, that allowed for immorality. We pushed heavily on those three things, but it all originated from a rejection of God's covenant, and then a rejection of the prophets that came and brought warning, because all the prophets are coming saying, turn, 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 turn. So look at verse 4. "Do not be like your forefathers, to whom the earlier prophets proclaimed, this is what the Lord Almighty says, turn from your evil ways and your evil practices. But they would not listen or pay attention to me, declares the Lord." So all the time that they are in the Babylon area for those 70 years, mindful of their history, mindful of their rejection of God's covenant and rejection of the prophets, knowing that Daniel and Ezekiel are there and they are writing and prophesying, and when they return, this remnant returns to Jerusalem, then they are kind of setting themselves back into familiar ways. So God raises up Haggai, God raises up Zechariah to say, enough, don't go down this path, return to me, finish the temple, finish your devotion with me so that I can bless you. Now, it's under that context that Zechariah is going to have 8 visions. And so chapter 1 through 8 is going to kind of look at 8 visions that Zechariah is going to have. We'll just skip across them quickly. He's going to have 8 visions in one night. I mean, that's a very busy, active night. And if you've ever had kind of a pizza dream, so to say, 8 visions in one night, that's intense. Then chapter 9 through 11 is going to point to the Messiah that will come, and it'll be his first coming, and he's going to come humbly. So while many did not recognize Jesus coming because they felt Messiah would come in strength and valor and victory in a military context, Zechariah illustrated that salvation would come in humility first. And then there would be a coming of the Lord in power, and that's the second coming. We have better understanding of this. Now, Zechariah is often referred to as like a mini Isaiah because he talks a lot about the Messiah to come, and we talk about the nature, his humble nature. So many scholars will do studies of Jesus right along these last chapters, from chapter 9 to chapter 14. There will be a study of Jesus because we see him both as shepherd, which was meek and humble, and that he suffered. And then we also have the promise of his second coming when he comes in great victory and valor as the King of all things. And so we're going to look just at the 8 visions that he has, and then we'll just show one verse basically, or one section to each of those, and then we'll get to the last sections pertaining to Jesus' comings. So the 8 visions, this is a look at the 8 visions that happened in this one particular night. There's a horseman and myrtle trees, and we'll talk just a little bit about each of them. 4 horns and carpenters. the surveyor of Jerusalem, a vision of Joshua, a lampstand and olive trees, the flying scroll, a woman in a basket, and then 4 chariots. So those are just like headers. And once again, we'll kind of talk about them as we go. So looking at the first one, the first vision is of this horseman and myrtle trees, which is that God is going to be bringing mercy to Jerusalem, and he's going to make war with the nations that have been adversarial towards Jerusalem and towards the Jewish people. But just looking at verse 16 and 17, therefore this is what the Lord says, I'll return to Jerusalem with mercy. There my house will be rebuilt. The measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem, declares the Lord Almighty. When it says the measuring line, you'll see this in the third vision of the surveyor. It's just that Jerusalem's going to be rebuilt. Jerusalem's going to expand. Jerusalem's going to grow. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Verse 17, proclaim further, this is what the Lord Almighty says, my towns will again overflow with prosperity, and the Lord will again comfort Zion and choose Jerusalem. Now, I find that to be a powerful, powerful thing, that it says he will choose Jerusalem. He will choose Jerusalem. Now, one thing that I didn't show you, but I'll just highlight it for your writing down or considering, this is the first vision that he's going to have of the 8 visions. It documents for us that these happen in one night in the 11th month of the 2nd year of Darius. It actually gives us the actual date, but also the 11th month. So it started off with the 8th month, and then now we're at the 11th month. So once again, there's time sequence, and we remember that Haggai was prophesying in the 9th month and even later on. But so God is choosing Jerusalem. With what we watch in the world today, with hostilities between Israel and Palestinians, lots could be said, and that's not the context of my talk here. However, I will say God has established very early on his choosing of Jerusalem for himself. I think it's important to remember that he has chosen Jerusalem for himself before even for his people. He chooses Jerusalem for his name. And we watch the hostilities, and God will always defend his name. In time, sometimes there is a period, a gap of time, which we'll actually point at with Zechariah. But he's establishing in this first vision, I'm choosing this city, and I will rebuild. So let's go to the second vision, and that would be of the 4 horns. And it says, I asked the angel who was speaking to me, what are these? And he answered, these are the horns. There were 4 horns that he saw that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Now, if you'll remember from Daniel has visions of horns, and horns were kingdoms. Horns were authority. They were nations. And that's just how they're visualized. So who were the 4 horns that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem? Well, we would say Egypt, Assyria, the Babylonians, and the Persians. And sometimes you could even argue maybe not even in that order. So the Assyrians are the ones that brought about the Assyrian captivity of 722 of the northern section of Israel. But if we would recall to our study of Jeremiah and studying the kings, there were 4 kings that Jeremiah is prophesying amongst, and the Egyptians were collaborative with the persecution of the Jews in that time that brought about Babylonian captivity there. So those would be the nations that are represented in this vision, and God is just depicting, I see them, and I will make restitution. He'll make war with them. If we go to the third vision is that God's protection. It says another angel came to meet him and said to him, run, tell that young man Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of men and livestock in it. I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I'll be its glory within. So this one is defined as the surveyor. And so we're in number one, it was that God's bringing mercy to Jerusalem and he's going to expand it. In the second vision, God's going to deal with the oppressive kingdoms. In this one, it's depicting that God's protection upon his city and upon his people. And and that it would be expanded, so great number of men and livestock within it. So just something that's interesting, you might find to be interesting is how Jerusalem has expanded. If we go back to antiquity, ancient Jerusalem would have had probably about, they estimate about 2,000 people, and in an area of about 12 acres. Like if you go to the old city of David, original Jerusalem, I've been there twice, it's not a huge area. And it would have been about 12 acres of about 2,000 people. And you look at Jerusalem today, it covers about 49 square miles, and you have about 875,000 people. And you say, man, the third vision is continuing to be fulfilled, where God is continuing to expand his city. If we keep going into the fourth vision, this one's going to be to Joshua, the high priest, and the fact that he will overcome Satan. So it's an interesting vision. You should read it. I'll read just two verses. Then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right side to accuse him. The Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan." Satan was accusatory towards Joshua. Now, let me just lean into our study of Haggai. Haggai we learned early on, and we saw it in Ezra. Once again, these all collaborate together. You had Zerubbabel, who you'll see in a second. Zerubbabel's the governor who's coming back with the commission from Cyrus to be the governor of Jerusalem and to make sure that the temple's rebuilt and to do finance. He's the one with the papers and the signet ring from King Cyrus of Persia. And then you had Joshua, who's the high priest. He's going to be the one who oversees the temple. He's going to be the one overseeing the altar and the sacrifices. And it's interesting to me that when you have what would be, call it some form of government and some form of religion, the church as you could say, and government, who is Satan opposing first? We would think that he would oppose government first. No, he opposes the worship of God first. If the worship of God falters, government will falter. Government is never going to hold up the worship of God. It might pull it down, just as we saw kings pulling the people of God down, and so prophets are raised up. But the adversary, Satan, makes attack against Joshua. And so the Lord is rebuking Satan. You can read that vision. It's a powerful one. But then that takes us then also inside of that, you have Joshua, who is seen in filthy rags, and he is instructed by the angel of the Lord to take off the filthy rags and to put on clean rags. It's a reinstituting of holiness. It's a reinstituting of the righteousness of God in his people. That takes us then to the fifth vision, and that would be of what's called the golden lampstand and two olive trees. So the golden lampstand is the temple, and the two olive trees are Zerubbabel and Joshua, the two men that are overseeing the reestablishment of the temple. And so God is going to talk to Zerubbabel now. We've had Joshua on the front side. Then we have this. So he said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. He's governor. He's the one instructed with the finance of things. He's the one that's supposed to protect the people. We read about the fear that they were having based on what Haggai prophesied. Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. It's not by your money. It's not by the money of Persia. It's not by your military, which you had none of. God is depicted to Zerubbabel and Ezra and in Haggai, and now in Zechariah, I will protect you. Lift me up, and I will protect you. This will be accomplished not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit. What are you, O mighty mountain, before Zerubbabel? You will become level ground. Then he will bring out the capstone to shouts of God bless it, God bless it. Or in some translations, grace, grace. The capstone certainly is a foreshadowing of Jesus. Jesus will identify himself as the capstone. He is the one who sits at the primary place of the temple and of the worship of God. And then that takes us to verse 8 in this. It says, Then the word of the Lord came to me, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple. His hands will also complete it. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. And then this great statement that a lot of you know, who despises the day of small beginnings or the small things? Men will rejoice when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. Now, just once again, if we take Ezra, Ezra said that when the foundations were laid, that some rejoiced and some wept. This isn't going to be glorious like Solomon's temple. And Ezra and Haggai said that this is God's working. Haggai says that the glory of this temple will exceed the glory in the first temple. It'll exceed the glory of Solomon's temple, and there will be peace. So Zechariah is prophesying in congruency with all this, and he's saying basically that this temple will be accomplished. It will be done by the work and hand of God, and there will be great peace there. Into the sixth vision, you see a flying scroll. This is the reestablishment of the Torah. I answered, I see a flying scroll 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, and he said to me, this is the curse that's going out over the whole land. For according to what it says on one side, every thief will be banished, and according to what it says on the other side, everyone who swears falsely will be banished. This is not just like against thieves or against liars. This is pushing wickedness out of the people of God. It's a reestablishment of the Torah. It's a reestablishment of the law of God, and that the law of God would push into homes, not just at the temple, but the law of God would be pushed into the hearts of people, even within their own homes. So then that takes us to the seventh vision, and he sees something. This is where we get very end times-ish. He sees a basket, and there's a woman in the basket. And it says, where are they taking the basket? So these angels, or it appears these figures are taking this basket, flying with it. Where are they taking the basket? I asked the angel who was speaking to me. He replied, to the country of Babylonia. Now that's interesting, because Persia had dominated now. Persia was the world empire, not Babylon. But he's pointing to the geography, not to the empire. So this is definitely an end times thing, because he's not pointing to Persia. He's pointing to the geography. It's present day Iraq and Iran area. And he says, to the country of Babylonia to build a house for it. When it is ready, the basket will be set there in its place. Now, when it is ready, that's of a later time. Now, many scholars will take this and will connect it all the way over to, will connect it to the book of Revelation. And in Revelation chapter 17, there's the prophecy of a woman coming with the beast and out of Babylon. And so this is understood by people of eschatological study, the study of end times, that this is a connection to Revelation 17. And then we take it to the last vision, and that's chapter 6. The angel answered me, these are the four spirits of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. And you see the glory of the Lord, but specifically if you read this vision, there's horses. He's going to see a red horse, a white horse, a black horse, and a spotted horse. And this is connected to Revelation 6. Once again, these two visions are end times fulfillment. In Revelation 6, we're going to read about a red horse, white horse, black horse, pale horse. And so he has seen something about end times happening and unfolding. So From that, then we go towards chapter 7. And in chapter 7 tells us that it's happening in the 4th year of Darius. So there's now been a period of time going from, the 2nd year to the 4th year. And Zechariah is going to say, and the word of the Lord came again to Zechariah. This is what the Lord Almighty says: administer justice, show mercy, compassion to one another. So they've had 2 years, so to say, to try and live this out, at least a year and a half. Do not oppress the widow or fatherless, the alien or the poor, and your hearts do not think evil of each other. Now, I'm going to show you something that Micah had prophesied way, way before, hundreds of years before, but it sounds very similar. So see this? And then this is what Micah had prophesied hundreds of years before. He has showed you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you: to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. So God is calling Zechariah to call the people back to live in this kind of manner in which they walk humbly with the Lord, they're compassionate to one another, that they administer the law in their heart and they carry it out to one another. Chapter 8 is going to go towards God blessing Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says: I'll return to Zion, dwell in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called the city of truth, and the mountain of the Lord Almighty will be called the holy mountain. I won't explore much of that other than God is saying, I'm going to bless my people. But he's still calling them. He's still calling them to abandon wickedness and to honor him, to have righteousness in their heart. From this, we get to the comings of the Lord, the first coming and the second coming. And in chapters 9 through 12, we see the Messiah coming in humility. Now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you 3 snapshots, okay? In chapter 9, verse 9, see, your king comes to you righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey. So we remember with Jesus, when he comes into Jerusalem, what are they calling? Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna means salvation, save us. And salvation was riding on a donkey into Jerusalem. So we see the coming of the Messiah. We see his harm that's going to come in chapter 11. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. In Matthew chapter 26 and 27, we read about the financial exchange that Judas made to betray Jesus. And how much was it? 30 pieces of silver. When he has regret over that, he brings the coins back to these priests, these high priests, the Sanhedrin that he had been paid. He brings the money back to them. They say in chapter 27 of Matthew, we cannot put this back in the temple treasury. So what do? They buy a potter's field for the dead to be buried. So it's a fulfillment. Matthew 26, 27 are fulfilling this exact prophecy that you see in Zechariah 11. Now one more. In chapter 12, they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. It's a visual of him being pierced. So in this first set of prophecies of the coming of the Lord, chapter 9 through 12, we see that Jesus is coming with great humility. Now, before I show you the second coming portion, I think it's helpful to insert something. And that is to understand something here. I'm going to show you 2 things, and then we're going to finish with chapter 13 and 14. So scholars suggest that Zechariah was not able to see the time gap. Okay, so what do I mean by that? In his visions, from that first vision to the 8th vision, and there's prophecy fulfillment still awaiting fulfillment. And then he's seeing the coming of the Lord, in what seems like humility and suffering, but then also in glory. And so why did people not understand the coming of the Lord in that separation of time? If I were to do this, if I were to do my hands, call it like this, even though you can see both hands, or let me turn my hand like this, even though you can see both hands, if you were to turn them, there's a gap, right? So I can expand that, and even on camera, it still kind of looks the same, even though the gap is there. So as I turn it, then you see the gap. Zechariah is seeing these visions on top of one another. He's seeing the coming of the Lord on top of one another, but he's not necessarily seeing the gap of time in between. And so the second thing to consider is that Zechariah, and this is interesting, Zechariah was eventually murdered inside the temple that was being rebuilt. So that's interesting that he is calling for these things, return to Jerusalem. He is calling for people to return to the Torah, that God's going to bless Israel. He's going to bless Jerusalem, that the law of God will get within the hearts of people and into their homes, that there will be a blessing on Joshua the high priest. There will be a blessing on Zerubbabel. This temple will be rebuilt. But then there's some end time things, and it's difficult to understand that and to find out that just like, remember the warning that Haggai gave, don't be like your forefathers, and Zechariah, don't be like your forefathers who rejected the prophets. Zechariah ends up being murdered in the temple. And this is what leads us into our chapter 13 and 14. So Matthew 23, Jesus is dressing down a number of the Pharisees. And he has just called them, in Matthew 23, has just called them, you brood of vipers, you snakes. And he's going to say, and so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. We only know that Zechariah was murdered in the temple because Jesus said, you murdered him. You murdered him in the temple. And then what's going to happen? From that, Jesus leaves in Matthew 23. Jesus leaves the temple. He goes to the Mount of Olives, which is just across the Kidron Valley. I've showed maps of this before. He's going to go up the Mount of Olives. The disciples are going to say, when is the end coming? And he's going to give the famous Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25, where he is going to talk about the end of the world, and he is going to talk about his coming again. And it is going to be entirely pointing at Zechariah chapter 13 and 14, specifically 14, where we read, and I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. We read about that in Revelation. We read about that in Matthew chapter 24. We read about that in Ezekiel 38. And the city will be captured. We read about that in Ezekiel 39. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. We're getting now to Revelation 18. We're also in Ezekiel 39. We're also in Matthew 24, where Jesus is depicting these things. On that day his feet will stand on Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Revelation 19 into Revelation 20 takes us in a confirmation of what Zechariah saw in the day ahead. The Lord will be king over the whole earth, and on that day there will be one Lord, and his name the only name. And it's with that Zechariah is going to come to a close. And so it's a powerful study as we think about Zechariah. It's a study, as I've said, many call it like a mini Isaiah because he talks so much about the Lord. But that's a look at the prophet Zechariah prophesying in concert and collaboration with Haggai in the time of Ezra. And we will close out our study of the minor prophets next week as we study the prophet Malachi. God bless you, and I hope you can join me for that study.